The chandeliers in the Hayes Innovation Center looked like they had been spun from frozen rain. Light pooled in their curves and spilled across the gold leaf of the ceiling, glancing off 100 glass flutes and the silver buttons of tuxedo jackets. Waiters moved like discreet currents through a crowded sea-black vests, white shirts, gloved hands, keeping the night polished and unruffled. Near the back door, half in shadow, Asha Bennett balanced a tray on her palm and watched the stage the way a lighthouse watches a storm. They called it the Halcyon Innovation Gala, but Halcyon belonged to birds, not people. People were human complicated and sometimes cruel. Asha knew that better than most. She knew what hunger sounded like when children pretended they weren't hungry. She knew the soft, tired rattle of a pill bottle that needed refilling. She knew the basement in a Buckhead mansion, where wires had snarled like winter vines, and where, on too many nights, she had given her ideas away. On stage stood Damian Whitfield, 42, the width of his smile calibrated like a metronome. Cameras loved him. Headlines loved him. He was the man who had supposedly invented a way to turn tiny vibrations into household electricity, a mosaic of thin plates and smart ceramics and capacitors he called Pulse Grid. The crowd loved that name. It felt like something you could buy, something you could applaud and then invest in. "Mr. Whitfield," the host sang, a woman in crimson silk whose voice seemed to bloom with every syllable. "You've changed how we think about access to clean energy." The audience clapped like rain on a tin roof. Damian lifted the crystal trophy and tucked his chin modestly, performing humility for the front row and the cameras. The host tilted her head. "Before we close, one last question. Who inspired you most on this journey?" His smile held. For a second, his eyes thinned, like the question had dragged a stone across the polished surface of his mind. "My life," he said, "and hard work." That was the moment when Asha set the tray on a cocktail table. She didn't look at the table to make sure it was steady. She just knew. Her hands remembered steadiness the way her heart remembered heat. She walked forward until fabric whispered against fabric, until people noticed the motion and made a path without admitting they were making one. "Excuse me," she said, calm and clear. "That invention isn't his." Sound didn't disappear from the room all at once. It fell in small pieces, a laugh cut in half, a wine glass stilled, a camera operator forgetting to refocus. Heads turned in an almost synchronized wave toward a woman in a server's uniform, brown-skinned, 39, hair gathered at the crown and face lit by the chandelier's diffused gold. Some people squinted the way people do when the sun finds them in a room that was supposed to be dark. Asha felt her pulse steady, as if her heart had finally found the right tempo. She wasn't shaking. She had already done her shaking in hospital waiting rooms when her mother's lungs fought the air, at grocery checkout lines when prices outpaced the money in her pocket, in a narrow upstairs room where she'd taught herself to think like a current instead of a current's shadow. She met Damian's gaze. His smile stayed, but it turned into a door with no handle. "I worked on Pulse Grid," Asha said, each word placed carefully like a component on a board. "In your parents' basement. I fixed it when it burned. I drew the diagrams you presented. You told me no one would believe me if I ever spoke." Her voice wasn't loud, but microphones aren't the only tools that carry sound. Silence carries it too. The ballroom gave her a wide, smooth silence, and her words traveled in it like a flat stone skimming a still lake. No one steps into a moment like that without a story that pushed them there. Asha's began far from the chandeliers, in a neighborhood where the power cut out so often, the dark became an uninvited cousin. As a little girl, she'd loved science the way some children love music, naturally, hungrily, with a joy that didn't require permission. She had once stood on a cafeteria stage at a county science fair, the only black girl among ribboned posters, explaining a handmade water filtration system to judges who kept trying to talk to her teacher instead. She won anyway, because sometimes clarity cuts through the fog of habit. Then came the years that teach you what life takes. Her mother's illness, her father's departure, the family ledger torn into columns of must and can't. College became a page she folded and tucked into her Bible with the beautiful lie she told herself later. She worked, laundromat by day, cleaning offices at night, babysitting on weekends, saving $5 bills in a jar whose lid squeaked when it turned. Asha learned how to make food stretch, and patience lengthen, and weariness behave itself. When she was hired as a housekeeper by the Whitfields' Damien's aging parents, she thought she had stepped into another country. The mansion was a geography of Polish, marble that lived under its own weather, rugs that muffled footsteps the way snow does, a basement that was less a basement than a laboratory with better lighting. Damien had just returned from California, scorched by the slow burn of a failed startup, and the basement became his theater of reinvention. The first time he spoke to her about the work, he was looking for a second pair of hands, not a mind. "Hold this," he said, in a voice that was kind enough to pretend it didn't know how to condescend. She held a spool of wire, then a board, then a small ceramic tile as thin as an unsent letter. She learned because learning was one of the few riches this life had not taken from her. On a winter night, when the radiators hiccuped and the house smelled faintly of lemons, she lingered after she had cleaned the basement. The board on the workbench had 3 wires crossed like forearms. She saw the problem because she was looking with a kind of attention that doesn't announce itself, the kind that grows in people who cannot afford mistakes. She uncrossed the wires, adjusted the resistor, and the indicator light warmed into green. "You touched this?" Damien asked the next morning when he found the board working. His expression said surprise. His tone said warning. "I followed the instructions you wrote," she said quietly. "I didn't want to leave it broken." He smiled a smile that didn't reach any part of him that could feel. "You're quick," he said. "Quicker than you look." He started asking her to help. It began with simple tasks, sweeping solder shards, cutting micro wires to length. But competence has a gravity of its own. She was diligent, then useful, then necessary. He did not name those transitions. Naming would have conferred something he was not prepared to give. Ideas arrived in her like weather. She thought of the cracked sidewalks of her block, of the shudder of buses and the thudding of upstairs neighbors, of people whose lives vibrated with effort. Couldn't that motion be harvested, gathered, stored? Asha sketched while the roast chicken browned, scribbled between loads of towels, erased and redrew a dozen times until the design held like a breath you realize you've been waiting to take. Arrays of piezoelectric tiles, current smoothing, micro-storage, safety overrides that wouldn't fail children. When she showed Damien her notebook, he lifted it with 2 fingers as if he had found it on the sidewalk. He read, turning pages slow enough to look thoughtful and fast enough to look proprietary. "Interesting," he said. "Very interesting." The next day he presented the design to a visiting investor, the notebook nowhere in sight. "You should patent this," she whispered once after a prototype finally ran a reading lamp in the basement, after they watched the thin bulb glow like a pale flower that had decided to open at midnight. "Maybe I should," he said lightly. Under my name, obviously. Who would believe a housekeeper came up with it? He laughed. She tried. The laugh caught in the lint of her throat and wouldn't pass. What do erasures feel like when they happen? They don't feel like explosions. They feel like being gently, consistently moved to the edge of a photograph. He began describing his garage years on interviews, how he tinkered alone while the world doubted him. Asha heard those stories the way a mother hears an inaccurate retelling of a birth. Some details polished until they gleamed, some missing entirely. He asked her to sign forms with dense language, non-disclosure work for hire, waiver of attribution. "It's just paperwork," his mother said, offering a pen the color of a summer dress. "Nick likes his files to be tidy." Asha signed because rent was a fact and health insurance a miracle and courage, sometimes a luxury. But human beings are not composed solely of fear and necessity. A streak of resistance thin as a wire, strong as tempered steel ran through her. She kept a copy of an early circuit diagram with her name on it, folded it small and flat. She saved emails where he asked her to test this, to try that, to adjust the thresholds. She kept a voice memo of him saying, almost accidentally, "We got it to work last night." That plural pronoun straying into truth. She set aside these items not as a plan, but as a hedge against forgetting herself. Weeks matured into months. The basement blossomed into a showplace. Damien brought interns who spelled admiration with a camera lens. Brought journalists whose pens took dictation from the glamour of a narrative they were already half sold on. Sometimes she was introduced as the woman who keeps this place running, and the room smiled indulgently, as if order were something incidental and not the scaffold that holds genius upright. Once an engineer looked at her and said, "I bet she knows where all the coffee filters are." And she answered evenly, "I know where the thermal runaway used to start too," and placed a plate of cookies on the table like punctuation. One night she found him on a call upstairs, laughing with that lazy confidence people use when they believe themselves unobserved. "She doesn't suspect a thing," he said. "She signed everything. Even if she had a case, who would take it? She's—" A pause. A snort from the other end. Soft laughter. The words weren't spoken, but they hung in the air. Just a housekeeper. Just a black woman. Just a pair of hands. Asha went to her room and sat on the edge of the bed, elbows on knees, palms covering her face the way you might shelter a candle from a draft. She didn't cry. She had learned early that tears don't always help. She breathed and listened to the dull hum of the city outside and felt something shift. She did not picture revenge. She pictured light. And then the gala arrived, dressed in other people's certainty. What happened after she spoke the truth looked like the slow turning of a ship that everyone had assumed was anchored. A judge on the awards panel rose, eyes narrowed against instinct and training. "Ms. Bennett," he asked, voice polite with the caution of a man approaching an unfamiliar instrument, "do you have documentation?" She unfolded the diagram she had kept for years, the paper gone soft from being opened and closed. She spoke about design choices, about a safety relay she added after the board scorched, about failure modes that left telltales only hands-on practice can read. She mentioned the emails, heads bent together, phones lifted higher. Someone had already begun a live stream. The internet is many things, a rumor mill, a chorus, a courtroom with too many benches. But that night, it was a carrier wave. Damien's composure frayed. He said words like confusion and misunderstanding. Then the legal vocabulary arrived as if he could conjure safety with its syllables. Non-disclosure, work for hire, waiver. He did not say deception, so Asha did. I signed what you gave me, she said. You counted on me not having what you had, time, money, lawyers. But paper can't swallow truth if truth is determined. By morning, the clip had traveled like a spark in a dry forest. People who had never known Asha said her name with a warmth that embarrassed her, that made her think of all the years names like hers were not said at all. An alliance of black women lawyers reached out and said, "We've got you." A professor from Georgia Tech DM'd to say the diagrams were real and elegant. A journalist who loved long stories more than quick ones asked if she could sit at Asha's kitchen table and listen. Asha wore a navy blouse to the interview because it made her feel like calm. Her hair was loose and round, a halo belonging to a woman who had decided she was finished asking for permission to be seen. "I'm not trying to destroy anyone," she told the camera. "I'm trying to exist in my own work. I want my name to be where my hands were." The legal part did what legal parts do, took time, turned circles, demanded patience. But even circles progress if you keep moving. In hearings, her lawyers laid the documentation in careful stacks. An expert testified about the signature of certain design errors and who had caught them. The contract's language was examined under a light brighter than any chandelier. "Unconscionable," one judge murmured, and the word ticked like a Geiger counter over a hot stone. Meanwhile, the other court, the one with columns of opinion instead of marble, rendered its own verdict. Sponsorships curdled and slid away from Damien's company. A think tank that had promised him a keynote rescinded it with a statement so bland it tasted like chalk. The board called a special meeting and discovered, with a surprise that was entirely performative, that their founding CEO had become a liability. They removed him. Then came the meeting that had once lived only in Asha's daydreams and nightmares, a conference room overlooking Midtown, a table large enough to seat a small town council, 3 people whose job descriptions included the word general, as in counsel and director, and an offer to update the patent, to put her name on the invention, to provide compensation and closure. Asha listened. She imagined her mother's hands knotted, tender, capable pulling a blanket around a sleeping child. She thought of teenagers with brains like lightning being told to dim themselves. She said, "I appreciate the recognition, but I am not going back to the basement. I want to build something my community can walk into." So they built it. Not overnight buildings with purpose resist being rushed, but soon enough that the need didn't have to wait as long as she had. The Clara Bennett Institute. She chose the name to remind herself that institutions can honor ordinary people, opened inside an old brick school whose windows had always been generous with light. Workbenches lined the rooms like pews. The floors sang under new piezo tiles that fed a bank of batteries humming behind glass. On a wall, someone painted the words she had once whispered to herself like a promise. "Your ideas are not a favor, they're a contribution." The girls arrived. They came with beads in their hair and notebooks with hearts in the corners, with cousins, with nervous mothers, with curiosity the size of the sky. They were drawn by scholarships and mentorships, and a rumor that in this building Showan would laugh at their questions. Asha taught soldering and patience in equal measure. She taught that every design fails first, and that failure is not shame, it's information. She taught them to say their names before they presented their projects. Not shyly, not like an apology, but like a headline they were proud to write. Sometimes she spoke at universities, not because she needed the honoraria, but because there were rooms full of people who needed to hear her tell a truth that sounded simple but felt, to some, radical. Brilliance grows everywhere. We have to stop pretending it's only found where money already lives. She turned down offers from companies that wanted to use her face like a bandage. She accepted partnerships with the city to retrofit community centers with pulse grid floors so that children's play helped light their libraries. News cycles wandered on, as they always do, but the changes built by patient hands stayed. Damien faded from view. The last public photo of him, someone told Asha, showed him in an airport slump, tie askew, reading a novel as if learning, finally, how to sit with a story where he was not the hero. One afternoon, months after the patent had been updated to show her name alongside his, an act that felt like a line of type finally finding its rightful place, Asha found a letter in the mail. No return address. The handwriting careful and slanted. "You won," it read. "I never thought you'd have the courage. I was afraid of your mind. I am sorry. D." She folded the letter twice and slid it into a folder with things that marked waypoints on the road she had walked. The first diagram with her name. A screen print of the live stream paused on her raised chin. A photo of the Institute's doors on opening day. Forgiveness, she had learned, didn't have to be loud. Sometimes it was just the absence of bitterness's echo. That evening she turned off the lights in the main lab and watched as the emergency strips glowed to life from the energy stored in the day's footsteps. The sound of the girls' laughter still hung in the hallways like warm air after a summer rain. She walked across the floor and felt each plate answer her in a language she understood down in her bones. The language of work, returning something to the worker, of motion gathered, of dignity becoming power. There were nights when she remembered the basement and the way her hands had trembled after she signed the first contract. She remembered how small she had felt, and how the smallness wasn't hers, but something placed on her like an ill-fitting coat. She remembered the way speaking had felt like stepping off a cliff and learning in mid-air that she had wings she hadn't known she carried. On those nights, she would sit in the quiet office near the Institute's entrance and write notes to the girls the way a gardener tucks compost around roots, small things that nourish slowly. "Don't wait for someone to invite you to your own brilliance," she would write, "and sign your work." Years later, the ballroom story had become a kind of urban legend told in classrooms and churches and family kitchens. The night a woman in a white apron interrupted a ceremony with the kind of truth that is both complicated and simple. Some people added flourishes, that the chandeliers flickered when she spoke, that the trophy cracked, that Damien tried to flee and the doors refused to open. Asha didn't correct them. People make myths when they need them. The facts were enough for her. She had stepped forward. She had been heard. She had built a place where others could step forward too. On a spring morning, Asha brought her mother health steadier now, laughter looser to see the Institute when the dogwoods were in bloom. Her mother touched the smooth tops of the workbenches like a woman in a sanctuary tracing the grain of a pew. "You made a church for clever girls," she said, eyes wet with a kind of tired joy that looked almost like relief. Asha shook her head. "Not a church," she said, smiling. "A home. Homes don't ask who you are before they let you in. Homes teach you your name and let you practice saying it." An hour later, a field trip arrived. Fifth graders in matching shirts, their chatter like birdsong. Asha knelt to the height of a girl who had shadowed herself behind her classmates. A girl who carried the careful quiet Asha recognized from mirrors long ago. "What do you like to make?" Asha asked. "Nothing," the girl whispered, then corrected herself. "Not yet." Asha squeezed her hand once, a gentle pulse. Yet is a powerful word, she said. Let's see what it can do. They walked to a table where a small board waited, 3 wires a little too eager to touch. Asha guided the girl's hands, steady, steady, and the indicator winked from stubborn red into patient green, a tiny sunrise on a winter morning. The girl laughed, sudden and round, and something in the air of the room shifted the way a curtain shifts when someone opens a window. When the class left, the floor plates stored their footsteps, and the lab lights hummed with the energy of a morning's worth of wonder. Asha sat in the doorway to watch the sun angle through the tall windows, dust motes spinning like constellations that had stooped to be seen. She thought, as she often did, of the people whose stories had sustained her when she was invisible, the mathematicians whose calculations wrestled rockets into the sky, the mothers who hauled water and pride with the same muscles, the janitors who knew the building's bones better than any architect paid to draw its caricature. She wrote their names on a whiteboard in the hallway as if to remind every girl who passed that history is not a private club. Before leaving that night, she locked the lab, turned, and paused. On the far wall hung a framed copy of the updated patent, her name carved into the bureaucratic poetry of the state. Next to it hung something less official and more true, a photo of 12 girls clustered around a table, mouths open mid-laugh, goggles askew, hands smudged with the graphite of possibility. Asha touched the glass lightly, not for luck, for gratitude, for the thin, stubborn line of self-belief that had held while winds tried to worry it loose. Outside, the city sounded like itself, tires whispering, a train complaining somewhere far off, 2 voices arguing and then easing back into friendship. She stepped onto the sidewalk and felt the plates underfoot translate her weight into watts. Somewhere a battery drank the power of her stride. Somewhere a library light burned a little longer because people had moved through their lives. She had learned the hardest way that invention is not only about devices. Invention is about inventing a life that refuses the smallness others offer you, about inventing a community where talent is ordinary and opportunity is not a rumor but a routine. That night she walked home without looking over her shoulder for permission. The moon rode low and full, and for once she believed the sky was not something above her so much as something within reach. In the years ahead, some of her students would build companies, and others would rebuild streets, and most would build themselves into the kind of women who stand at microphones when necessary, and at workbenches when needed, and at kitchen sinks when life requires every role at once. They would sign their work. They would remember the woman who had interrupted a gala, and by doing so made room for them in places that remain allergic to equity. If anyone asked Asha what she had invented, she would say, with a smile that held both humility and fact, a way to turn footsteps into light. Then she would add, because truth is rarely single-layered, and a way to turn silence into a voice that carries. If this story leaves you with one truth, let it be this. Dignity is not granted by titles, it's claimed by voice. Credit matters because it tells our children what is possible and who belongs in the light. When your work is on the table, sign it. When fear says, stay quiet, remember that silence often protects the wrong people. And when someone braver than you speaks first, be the echo that carries their words farther. Look around your life. Who is doing genius in the shadows, at home, at work, on your street? Say their names. Pay them fairly. Open a door. Every step we take can power a light, and every honest word can power a life. What part moved you most? Share your takeaway in the comments. If you believe in stories that lift unseen heroes, Subscribe and stay with us for the next journey.